Welcome to another episode of Breaking Into Cybersecurity, where we hear the careers of individuals that have come from different areas, transitioned into cybersecurity through different winding paths, and allow us to peer into their own cybersecurity journey and give us tips and tricks so that we could do that for ourselves. Today, we have MK Palmore sharing his journey into cybersecurity. MK, why don't you let the audience know a little bit more about yourself?
Christoph, thanks for the introduction and thanks for inviting me and having me on the show. My name is MK Palmore. I'm a cybersecurity leader and practitioner. I lead a small boutique consulting firm called Apogee Global RMS, which is engaged in enterprise risk management across both cyber and physical security lanes. My career in cybersecurity extends beyond a decade, but my formative experience in breaking into cyber started during my career as a special agent in the FBI. I had the benefit of an opportunity to lead a very large scale cybersecurity investigative team in the FBI during the last 6 years of my time in service. When I retired from government, I went on to work for two Fortune 500 companies as a cybersecurity executive before starting my own firm.
In your formative years of your career, did you have interest in technology, in security?
I'm a vintage 1969, born and raised in the 70s and 80s. I came of age in the 80s during the personal computing explosion. I was one of the young kids in the 80s who had the Commodore 64 and explored all things basic language. When I went to college at the US Naval Academy, I then wanted to major in computer science, which was offered as a major even in the late 80s. And took myself into a state of fear because I knew how hard it was going to be to get through the 4 years of matriculation at that school, and decided not to major in computer science because I thought, in addition to all of the math and science courses that I was required to take as a midshipman, I thought it might be too much of an academic burden. So I've always had an interest in technology, always been a early adopter, if you will, of technology, but I did not ultimately major in computer science. And it's interesting to me from a career standpoint that I've been able to pivot back into the technology space that I was always interested in.
What got you into the FBI and how did that transition to your career into cybersecurity?
Yeah, so in my final year of service with the US Marine Corps, I was a commissioned officer in the US Marines. I decided I was going to leave my career in the Marines and I was looking to federal law enforcement, specifically the FBI. I literally walked into the FBI field office in San Diego, spoke to the applicant recruiter, and was on my way 9 months later back to Quantico to train as a special agent in the FBI. I was very interested in the FBI because of the variety of things that it did in terms of its responsibilities. And so I thought by continuing my service and continuing in a career in the FBI that I would be allowed to do multiple things during my career. And it certainly met that expectation. I had an opportunity in the early days of my time in the Bureau to be a counterterrorism investigator, bank robbery investigator. I served on two FBI SWAT teams. It wasn't until midway through my career that I got my first, what I would call technology infused cyber case assigned to me. I was a counterterrorism agent at the time, and we were investigating at the time that the Bureau was hot and heavy on the idea that the terrorist networks were using the internet to communicate with one another and to deliver potential exploits in a digital environment. And so that was my first exposure midway through my career. Later on, I was able to raise my hand and say that I wanted to go into the cybersecurity field, and the FBI provided me access to all of the training that I would need in order to get my CISSP certification and get trained up through the training and exposure to real world scenarios in terms of the cases and the leadership opportunities I had. I was exposed to all things national security and also things motivated in terms of the criminal investigative realm in cybersecurity. So I got an opportunity to see quite a bit.
So it sounds like you always took a very deliberate and active route in choosing your career and your career path.
I think that it's great that you picked that up. I'm a planner for sure. Every aspect of my career is the result of intentional planning, putting pieces into place, playing what I call the long game. Even my interest in cybersecurity, I knew that not only was it an interesting field for me to dive into as a special agent in the FBI, I knew that I would ultimately be able to parlay my investigative experience, my leadership experiences in the cyber field into a follow-on career when my opportunity to retire from government service came. Everything's been infinitely planned out. I haven't landed in all of the places that I have expected to land, but this is a manifestation of my career aspirations. Even me operating my own consulting firm now is a manifestation of something that I had planned for myself many years ago.
So, talking about the planning necessary to develop your career, let's kind of walk through how you planned out the different skills and capabilities that you felt were necessary as you transitioned through your roles in the FBI.
Yeah, so that's interesting. One of the things I caution people, on the one hand, I think that my story certainly is an example of the fact that anyone can break into this field. This field and the technology is learnable, it's teachable, but you have to be willing to put in the time, effort, and work in order to ingest, understand the information, and then you have to find a way to apply it. Otherwise, without the application of the theory, you really don't have much to go off of. As we've seen today, there are folks with degrees that still can't get jobs in cybersecurity unless you have the practical application. It makes it extremely difficult. I come from a fairly studious background. I went to one of the service academies. I survived that 4 years. I know how to study, and I knew that cybersecurity was going to be difficult for me to break into. And what I literally did with the FBI is I started with the basics. Wonderful career for me. I got to do everything that I wanted to do in that career as an FBI special agent. And one of the things was, again, raising my hand and saying I wanted to understand and be a part of the FBI's investigations into technology. And I started with the basics. To this day, I'm a big believer in the SANS organization. They were the go-to organization. They probably still are for the FBI in terms of cyber training. There were some other things that I sought outside of the typical SANS training myself that the FBI supported. But I started with the basics, and then I literally walked through the roadmap and would build on those basic concepts and then look for opportunities to take those concepts into the real world through either investigations or additional study. The combination of those two things has ultimately resulted in a unique position I think I have in the industry, which is conceptually understand quite a bit. And I'm also able to relay those conceptual ideas to audiences of all veins, everything from non-technical through technical audiences. And I find a sweet spot in a way about communicating about these theories and concepts and the what we see in the real world in terms of how these concepts are being used. And I have a way of talking about it that ensures that everyone walks away with an understanding of it. The biggest compliment that I get from time to time is engaging people in conversation about this.
You bring up a very important point as to how important the skill of communication and engaging with stakeholders actually is within cybersecurity, because often people focus on the hard technical skills, but there's a lot to be learned from extracting the points from those that you're investigating, from those that partook or saw what happened, to get the evidence that you need to investigate what you're investigating properly, and having the ability to then relay that to stakeholders, executives in a normalized fashion is a learnable but difficult skill.
This is the critical thing that I think has been the challenge of elevating cybersecurity to the C-suite, and certainly the most recent experience of elevating it to board level conversations, is that the folks who are amazing, technically minded folks who can actually engage and bring to reality the ideas and concepts in the cybersecurity field oftentimes forget this necessary skill of being an excellent communicator. And I tell folks time and time again, if you expect to be elevated to the ranks of the decision makers and stakeholders, you have got to hone your communication skills, because at the end of the day, the folks who are your colleagues at the stakeholder level oftentimes are not technically minded. You have to be able to communicate in their terms, which are business terms. I wanted to understand the language of business, because you need to be able to communicate in terms of risk and risk management and not necessarily ones and zeros, because the ones and zeros go over people's heads all the time. And if you can't talk about impact and how that potential impact is going to result in a disruption or a potential disruption of business operations, If you can't put it into those terms, it oftentimes not only goes over people's heads, they tend to diminish the potential impact of it to the enterprise because they really don't understand from a risk standpoint what it is that you're trying to relay to them. So I think personally, and in my experience has been of the folks that I've seen that have been elevated to these truly high level leadership roles, they have always been outstanding communicators. And the ones who are not typically do not survive in the upper echelon.
I can't help but notice the musical equipment in the background, and oftentimes goes unnoticed that the great communicators and the great leaders have outside skills that really allow them to normalize themselves and communicate in a fashion to the audience to be able to reach them and touch them. I think communication is such a skill and talent that is overlooked. Couldn't help but point that out.
Yeah. I'm a huge fan of music. My father was a trained jazz musician, and I grew up on jazz music and all kinds of music from the 70s, 80s, and of course the 90s. I'm a hobbyist drummer, and it certainly serves as an outlet for me. But my love of music is very extensive. I have a fairly eclectic sense of musical taste, and you can see some of the posters on the wall, everything from Miles Davis, John Coltrane, some of the standards. I'm a big Linkin Park guy and Marvin Gaye there behind me. And what you don't see on the wall is Prince and Dave Matthews Band and some other things. So I'm all over the map.
Pivoting back to cybersecurity, so you went through your career as an FBI agent, you honed your skills there. Now you're running your own consultancy. Talk about the transition out of the FBI and into the private sector. What was that like? And what sort of cultural differences would those individuals that are used to government life or government work face when they come into the private sector?
There's a couple of things baked into your question. So the transition from the public to private sector was not a difficult one for me. And I think that it wasn't difficult because of one thing. My entire life, I've been a doer. I've been oriented towards action. And I believe that people who are action oriented, who like to get things done, will find success in whatever it is that they choose to do. People are always looking for, and they always want to be working with people who are oriented towards getting stuff accomplished. I found it useful in my public service career. I found it useful in the private sector. I think where people get hung up in terms of their transition from government service to the private sector is that oftentimes you come from government service with this you're oriented around like a rank structure, around titles, around who is specifically responsible for doing what in a very hierarchical environment. My experience coming into the private sector was, hit the ground, figure out how you can add value and go about getting that done immediately. Oftentimes you're a team of one looking for collaborators in the private sector space. And when you find collaborators, it's important to understand that you're all operating potentially at the same level, even though there may be some differences in terms of pay bands and structures, but collaboration has been the key to my success in the private sector, and understanding that even if I'm an individual contributor or I'm leading a team, collaboration outside of that team becomes vitally important. Recognizing early on and then executing on that. It's not that they can't get it. It's just that oftentimes, again, from those of us that come from the public sector, we like our organization and we like things to be spelled out to us. Who's in charge, who's not in charge, who's expected to do the work, the hands-on activity, and who's not. And you have to get away from that mindset when you come into the private sector. It's an all hands on deck. Everybody's contributing towards the bottom line, which in most instances is revenue generation. And if you can't figure out how to plug into that cycle and contribute to it, you might find yourself sitting on the bench. One of the reasons that I have go through that experience being a part of a big institution like the FBI, and then two fairly large institutions, one Palo Alto Networks, a very large scale. I had an amazing experience there that I leveraged into the experience at Google Cloud. Being at Google for almost 4 years was an amazing experience. But what I saw in the three of those entities, the FBI, Palo Alto Networks, and Google Cloud, was I saw an emphasis on big enterprise. The FBI only responded to cases that involved large scale loss, large scale opportunity for the agents to learn, large scale impact. And so the smaller entities oftentimes fell by the wayside. My experience in the private sector is such that the big companies go after the big wins. They're looking for those big opportunities to impact enterprise because that represents long-term revenue generation and the kind of revenue that makes the stockholders happy. And what I saw in that respect was the small to medium-sized businesses typically doesn't get all of the attention that they deserve. And the funny thing is that SMBs have to operate, quite frankly, at the same level of capacity and capability as the big firms on the landscape, but they don't oftentimes have the resources, they don't have the experience, and they don't have the know-how to be able to build and do that at scale. And they find themselves chasing the model that's essentially the model that the large scale enterprise companies like. You hire a bunch of security professionals, you look to bring on a chief information security officer, and it takes time to build up an apparatus. And oftentimes these small firms have waited too late to build, and they find themselves chasing the security paradigm throughout their maturation. I'm trying to bust that model up, which is, hey, get yourself some fractional expertise in there in an interim fashion that can bridge the gap between you building your own security team while offering you enterprise level skills and capabilities. I've aligned myself with folks with very similar experiences like my own, deeply experienced people who are ready to do fractional work. And so our model is to help them build, operate the security team, and then ultimately transfer so that we can move on to other projects and help other companies scale and do the same thing. So it's that sweet spot, that space where there's revenue generation, but they haven't made the investment in the security apparatus that will come in time. And we want to help show them how to scale that and how to invest in it in a fashion that will get them there without breaking the bank.
So, question along those lines, like, how do you help them balance the all hands on deck approach with still needing to define the roles and responsibilities, say in a BCDR plan or IR plan, where you do need to define, hey, you're the incident lead, you need to do these things. Hey, you're responsible for this, or we need to have someone responsible for this. So we have separate responsible duties and help them understand that this sort of formality is needed at certain times, and you still need to have the structure in responding.
Yeah, it's very difficult to teach that conceptually. I think that, like many things in life, these organizations have to experience the hardship of understanding that they need to build out a functioning security apparatus. And oftentimes that comes through the lens of compliance. My experience has shown me, and one of the reasons we focus on compliance frameworks for my team at Apogee is because we find that many firms get to the compliance level and they realize that, hey, we need to comply with a particular framework in order to be able to do business with X, Y, and Z. And it's through that lens that they come to understand that they don't have necessarily all the pieces in place. They don't have all the personnel in place. Not only have they not done the things typically on an annual basis that you need to do in order to justify alignment to those frameworks, but they haven't even thought about it in those terms. It's through that experience, the desire to generate increased revenue, that we step in. We help them get their hands wrapped around what it would look like to build a functioning security apparatus. The reason we take a bridge approach is because ultimately they're going to need to build their own security team. But we want to come in, we want to be helpful, we want to align, provide them with the pieces that they need. The incident response commander, the virtual or fractional CISO who can take the strategic responsibility. We want to provide them with a compliance manager who can make sure that the documentation necessary to justify their alignment to a particular alignment or framework is there and present, and teach them through action that these pieces are necessary. And my plan as a business owner is not to be in there permanently. It's to be in there long enough to help them build the apparatus on their own and then hand it off. Think of a case like a project. It has a beginning, a middle, and it has an end state that's desirable. And once you reach that end state, you've packaged it up. It's time to move on to the next thing. And so I built my entire business model around this idea of being project oriented. And so the idea is to provide impact. Everybody can make a living off of it, but they get, in practical terms, the expertise that they're looking for, but that ultimately the relationship comes to some kind of end because we've gotten them to where they desire to be, and we can march off and help someone else do the same thing.
Yeah, I find one of the interesting challenges point back to revenue generation and
Mhm.
understanding where that value is for the organization, but oftentimes leaders can't point to where the risk to that value is to determine, hey, this is what the impact would be should we lose the ability to service our customers for 10 hours a day, a week. So it's hard for them to say this is going to be the impact analysis and helping them convert that from a medium risk to a $10,000 or $1 million risk in a number becomes thought exercise that you really have to walk them through.
Yeah, most of the firms that we work with or intend to work with will never have done a business impact analysis, and that's part of the reason why we come in to help them understand that had you hired on a security professional very early on in your development stage, this is something that would have been on their plate, and likely they would be annually conducting these BIAs or telling you what the potential impact of business is. It's not uncommon for us to get engaged and get attached to a company who's never done that, never done the incident response, never walked through a tabletop exercise in terms of what a bad day looks like. But they recognize that, again, in order to take that next level up, in order to be able to do business with the likes of, say, the US federal government, or if you're in the financial lanes, if you're ready to start doing those things that may require PCI, DSS amplification and or accreditation, you need to put the pieces of these things in place. And certainly I've had lots of exposure to the startup community, but I also now find as a business owner, a complete and fortunate business opportunity for companies at those early stages that have made the investment. They're building a viable product. They're generating some revenue. And then all of a sudden they recognize that, hey, in order to take the next step up, we need to comply with a particular framework. And that's where we come in and are helpful and impactful.
Now, speaking of startups, let's talk about how you keep up with evolving technology for your own career and what
Yeah.
tips you would give for individuals that are looking to continue to build their
I
future.
mean, once you're in this ecosystem, information's coming at you from all angles. It's important for you to create your own streams of interest. You have to read, you have to keep up with the industry breakthroughs, with what's happening on the landscape and what's potentially going to happen in the future. You don't have to go in depth on it, but you need to get educated on what the potential impact is so that you understand how it fits into the overall ecosystem. Artificial intelligence is a great example of that, right? I was at Google when their focus went from all of the various places for which they were focused into what they were going to be able to deliver around artificial intelligence. And I feel as a new business owner that AI is a game changer for organizations. I'm able to do things as a business owner now that I would not have been able to do a year ago, 2 years ago, without having to hire additional talent and or to pay large sums of money to folks with particular skills and expertise. So not only am I bullish on AI, but I figured out how to leverage it and use it for the purposes of expanding productivity of my business and the folks that work on my team. That's a great example. Like, people are still not quite sure how to lean into artificial intelligence. This is one of those things that if you wait too long to make the investment, you're going to end up spending unnecessary dollars in areas where you could be cutting costs and doing some different things that increase your productivity, increase your effectiveness. These things are coming at us. And I tell you, it won't be too long over the next probably 5 to 8 years before we see an advancement in, say, quantum computing that blows the whole AI talk out of the water. And the next thing, we're on to the next hype cycle of technology and what it's going to mean to business practitioners. So stay educated, read, watch videos, listen. If something interesting comes across the line, take the time out to read and get educated on it. If you're of the mindset that things like certifications are helpful to you, definitely pursue them. I think that certifications represent the best short-term, like, ROI in terms of investment of time, potential money and resources into what you're going to get on the backside. I'm lined up to pursue another certification now, even at this stage of my career, because I think it'll be helpful to the business outcomes that we have at Apogee Global. And I think it remains a viable route. You just, of course, have to be diligent about picking. You have to be diligent about picking a resource that's actually going to be helpful to you and deliver impact in terms of what you're looking for in terms of return on investment.
You could go in for another half hour on what you said on AI, but I'll just leave folks with trust but verify when you go in with AI, and ensure that you put some process controls around what you give it access to before you let it loose in your environment.
Yep.
Because
And that's part of what we do at Apogee is we help entities understand how to adopt it, govern, but use it to make sure they get the productivity and are still at the same time protecting themselves.
thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.